The night had a silence that was almost too heavy for the small town to bear, as if the stars themselves had chosen to hold their breath. Beyond the creak of weathered wooden boards and the distant cry of a coyote, there lingered a tension that no one could name, though every heart seemed to feel it. The wind whispered against the shutters of Burke's saloon, carrying with it the scent of smoke, whiskey, and something darker, fear. Behind closed doors, destinies were shifting. May sat rigid on the splintered floor of the back room, her wrists bound cruelly with coarse rope, the fibers digging deeper every time she moved. She tried not to flinch as the burning pain tightened around her skin, tried not to let her tears fall where Lily could see. Her younger sister crouched close, trembling so violently that her small frame looked like it might break in half. Lily's breath came in short, uneven bursts, and every sound seemed to echo louder than it should have in the suffocating room. Two men stood over them, shadows made flesh. Burke, broad-shouldered with cruelty stamped into every line of his face, and Sykes, the knife in his hand, glinting with a hunger that was more than just steel. "You can't pay me in coin." Burke's voice rumbled like thunder, low and dangerous. "Then you pay me in flesh." The words clawed at May's chest, stealing the last remnants of breath she had. She could feel Lily's gaze on her, those wide, terrified eyes silently begging for salvation. May's heart cracked beneath the weight of that plea, for what could one broken woman do against such monsters? Burke's hand gripped her arm, his fingers pressing with bruising force, his breath hot and vile against her cheek. "You or her," he growled, dragging his gaze to Lily. "Your choice." The room spun. For a heartbeat, May felt herself falling as though all light had been stolen from the world. She closed her eyes, tasted blood on her lips from the slap he had given her, and in that crushing moment she chose. Trembling, with a voice not quite her own, she whispered, "I took it off. Please, please let her go." The words hung in the air like a confession, breaking her spirit in two. It was not her body they demanded yet, but her pride, her dignity, her soul. Her sacrifice, raw and desperate, was the last fragile shield between Lily and the abyss. Lily's cry tore through the walls, raw and piercing, reaching the ears of a man who had not expected to find himself part of another's story that night. Jack Colton sat alone in the saloon's front room, his glass of whiskey untouched, his thoughts heavy as always, with memories too sharp to dull. He had come seeking nothing more than quiet, a man who kept to himself, who had learned long ago that silence was safer than hope. But the sound that cut through the floorboards now was no ordinary cry. It was the echo of another night, 10 years ago, when his own daughter had screamed for help, and he had arrived too late. Jack's hand froze on the glass. His chest tightened as if iron bands wrapped around it, and for a moment he was not in the saloon at all. He was back in the nightmare he could never erase, his daughter's small hand slipping from his own, her voice silenced by a gunshot that still rang in his dreams. The weight of regret pressed down on him, years of promises broken to himself. Never again, never to fight, never to kill. He had buried his gun with his grief, swearing to let the world crumble without his interference. But the plea of Lily's voice tore those vows apart like paper in the wind. Jack rose, slow and deliberate, his boots striking the wooden floor with the echo of a man walking toward fate. Conversations faltered. The piano man's fingers stilled on the keys, and the few drunks at the bar looked up with wary eyes. As he pushed open the door to the back, the scene before him froze him where he stood. May, her blouse torn at the shoulder, her eyes brimming with despair. Lily, bound and sobbing, begging for mercy that would not come. Burke looming, his grip like a vice, and Sykes with his blade catching the dim lamplight. For a heartbeat, time bent. Jack was once more a grieving father, staring at everything he had lost. But then his jaw set, his hand twitched toward the revolver at his hip, and the years of silence cracked beneath the weight of destiny. "This is no business of yours, old man," Burke spat, his grin slick with arrogance. "Turn around." But Jack did not turn. His eyes locked on May's, and though her lips did not form the words, he read them all the same. Please, a woman willing to sacrifice herself, a sister giving her life for family. His heart thundered like war drums. He had sworn never to draw, never to spill blood again. But here it was, the same question, the same moment, carved into his bones. Walk away and let the world fall, or stand and bear the weight of justice. The air was thick enough to choke, every breath strained with anticipation. Jack's fingers brushed the worn leather of his holster. Burke laughed, cruel and sharp. "She already offered herself up," he sneered, shoving May forward. "Said she took it off. Brave sister. Maybe I'll take the young one too, just to be fair." Lily's cry shattered whatever chains remained around Jack's soul. In one smooth motion, his revolver cleared its holster, steel gleaming like a sliver of moonlight. The sound of the hammer pulling back was thunder itself. Burke's grin faltered. Sykes froze mid-motion, his knife trembling in his hand. And in the silence that followed, every soul in that room knew the truth. Jack Colton meant every ounce of the promise etched in his cold stare. "Untie them." The words were quiet, but they struck harder than any shout. They were law, carved into stone. Burke hesitated, eyes flickering between Jack's revolver and May's trembling form. For the first time, fear cracked his mask. He yanked at the rope with a curse, and Lily stumbled into May's arms, sobbing with relief. They clung to each other, fragile but unbroken. A sliver of hope flickered in the dark. Jack's gun never wavered, his stance as immovable as the mountains. Only when the sisters were free did he speak again, voice colder than steel. "Get out!" Burke spat on the floor, humiliated, his pride cut deeper than any wound. "This ain't over. You'll pay for this, old man." The door slammed shut behind them, their footsteps fading into the night. Silence lingered. May turned to Jack, her voice raw and broken. "Why would you help us? You don't even know who we are." Jack's eyes carried shadows too deep to name. His hand lowered the revolver, sliding it back into its holster as if burying something far older than the weapon itself. "Because someone should have helped my daughter," he murmured, "and nobody did." The words struck May harder than any blow. She held Lily tighter, her sister's tears dampening her shoulder. Outside, the night stretched endless, stars trembling above the horizon as though the heavens themselves mourned. Yet within the fragile circle of that moment, healing had begun. Slow, uncertain, but real, a man broken by grief had chosen to stand. Two sisters, scarred by cruelty, had found a protector when they least expected it, and though none of them knew it yet, This night was not an ending, but the very beginning of something that could change them all. So, my friend, if you felt the tremor of May's sacrifice, if Lily's cries touched something deep inside your soul, or if Jack's haunted choice stirred your own heart, I ask you gently, let your presence here be more than silence. A like, a comment, a subscription is not just a gesture. It is a way of telling stories like this one that they still matter, that healing and courage deserve to live on. Share your voice, so these voices do not fade. And with that, the story moves forward into the uncertain dawn, where danger still lingers beyond the saloon doors, and where the fragile spark of trust between a weary rancher and two broken sisters begins to grow into something far greater. The night followed them like a shadow as Jack led the sisters out of town. The dirt road stretched ahead, silent but heavy with the memory of what had nearly happened. May clutched Lily close, her hand trembling as though she feared that if she loosened her hold even slightly, her sister might vanish into the darkness. Jack walked beside them with measured steps, the weight of his revolver still hanging heavy at his side. He had done what needed to be done, but he knew that in the West no good deed went unpunished. Burke would not forget, and men like him always came back with sharper teeth. The sisters said little as they crossed the moonlit plain, but Jack could feel their questions in the silence. Why had he saved them? Why risk his own neck for strangers? The truth burned in him, heavy and unspoken, because he had failed before, because saving them, even for one night, was a chance at redemption his soul desperately craved. When they reached his ranch, the house rose against the horizon like a weary sentinel. The porch lantern flickered, casting soft shadows across the wooden boards, weathered and scarred by time. Jack paused at the gate, his eyes roaming over the familiar land, once vibrant, now tired, yet still standing. He had not expected to share this place with anyone again, least of all two women whose lives were tangled with his by fate. Inside, the air smelled of earth and wood smoke. Jack moved with quiet ease, pouring water into tin cups and setting bread on the table. The sisters ate in silence, every bite a reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. May's eyes darted often toward him, searching for answers in the lines of his face. She saw the strength of a man carved from years of storms, but also the sorrow that weighed on him like a chain he could never break. At last, her voice broke the stillness. "What happens when he comes back?" she asked, her tone a mixture of fear and weary resolve. Jack leaned back in his chair, his gaze steady. "He will come. Men like Burke don't forgive humiliation. But when he does, he'll find I'm not the only one ready." His words carried the weight of certainty, yet May caught the quiet pain beneath them. He was not only fighting Burke, he was fighting ghosts of his own making. She studied him for a moment, and something inside her softened. This man, worn and scarred, had given her and Lily a chance at life. In the warmth of that room, amid breadcrumbs and flickering lantern light, a fragile trust began to take root. The hours slipped by, heavy with exhaustion. Lily leaned against May, her breath finally evening out into sleep. Jack rose, taking a blanket from the chest by the wall, and draped it gently over the younger sister's shoulders. His hand lingered for a moment, then withdrew, as though even kindness was a burden he struggled to allow himself. May's eyes followed him, her chest tightening at the tenderness hidden beneath his stoic mask. When dawn crept over the horizon, painting the land in shades of gold and pale blue, May stepped outside. The air was crisp, carrying with it the faint scent of sage and dust. She pulled her shawl tight, watching as Jack moved with quiet purpose across the yard, feeding his horse and checking the fence line. His movements were deliberate, steady, those of a man who had survived too much but refused to yield. "You really think Burke will come today?" she asked softly when he passed near the porch. Jack paused, his expression unreadable. "Burke is a man who doesn't like being shamed. He'll come, and when he does, he won't be alone." Fear flickered in her chest, sharp and relentless. Yet when she looked at him, standing tall against the morning light, she felt something else stirring too, an odd, fragile sense of safety. He carried his scars like armor, and though he stood alone, he seemed unbreakable. Later that morning, Jack saddled his horse. "Stay inside," he told them firmly. "If trouble comes before I return, take Lily and hide in the root cellar. Do not open the door until I give word." His voice allowed no argument. May nodded, though her heart resisted the thought of him riding into danger alone. Still, she watched him mount and ride toward town, the sun casting long shadows behind him, and for the first time since the nightmare began, she whispered a silent prayer. For him, for them, for the fragile hope that was beginning to blossom amid the ashes. The town was already stirring when Jack entered the saloon. Burke sat at a table with Sykes, and beside them lounged Deputy Crow, his badge gleaming in the light like a false promise. The air thickened the moment Jack stepped inside, his presence a storm pressing against fragile walls. "Well, well," Burke drawled, loud enough for every ear to catch. "The old rancher thinks he can play hero. Did you think saving them made them free? You paid one debt, Colton, but you haven't paid me." Jack's eyes never wavered, his voice steady, every word cutting with quiet steel. "They are free, and if you ever lay a hand on them again, you'll answer to me." Crow leaned back, smirking, the corruption in his smile as plain as the dust on the floor. "Careful, Colton. You forget who holds the law in this town. If Burke says they owe him, then they owe him. That's how it works." For a long, suffocating breath, silence reigned. Jack's gaze locked with Crow's, his jaw tightening. "Not this time," he said slowly, each word like a stone dropped into water. "Not while I'm still breathing." The saloon shifted, whispers rising. Some turned away in fear, others leaned forward as if tasting courage for the first time. And Burke's grin sharpened, though unease flickered in his eyes. "Then I guess we'll see who this town belongs to," he spat. The line had been drawn, and all knew it. The fight would not wait long. Back at the ranch, May and Lily sat near the window, every sound from outside making their hearts race. May pressed her sister's hands in her own, whispering healing words, promises she was not sure she could keep, but needed to believe. "We are safe now, Lily. We are not alone anymore." And though fear still wrapped around them, May felt the echo of Jack's voice in her chest. One man with a steady hand and a clear conscience could be enough. The wind shifted, carrying with it the scent of dust and distant thunder. Somewhere on the horizon, Burke was gathering his storm. And here, in the fragile shelter of one ranch, love, trust, and courage began to take root, preparing for the reckoning that was sure to come. The day of reckoning arrived sooner than anyone had expected. By noon, dust lifted on the horizon, a rising cloud that carried with it the weight of vengeance. Jack stood on the porch of his ranch, rifle resting easily in his hands, shoulders square against the years that had bent him but never broken him. His eyes narrowed as the shapes of riders sharpened against the sunlight. Burke at the lead, Sykes close behind, and Deputy Crow riding with his badge shining like a lie in the noon glare. Their arrogance was plain, but behind them trailed more men, faces hard and hungry for violence. Inside, May and Lily hovered near the door, their breaths shallow. May pressed her hand against her sister's trembling fingers, whispering softly, "We are stronger than fear, Lily. Remember that." Her words were fragile, yet healing, weaving a small shield around the younger girl's heart. She herself trembled, but she refused to let it show. Neighbors began to gather along the dusty road, drawn by the commotion, by the storm that had been promised. Men and women of the town, once silent under Burke's cruelty, now stood with cautious eyes. Some came with hope, some with doubt, but all came with the unspoken understanding that something greater than debt and fear was about to be decided. Burke reined his horse to a halt before the porch, his face twisted in a sneer. "Colton," he called, his voice booming, "you think you can defy me? You think these girls are free because you say so?" He pointed at May and Lily, his tone dripping with venom. "They are mine, by debt, by law, by right." Jack's voice cut through the heated air, steady and clear. "The law is not a man's greed. The law is justice, and justice has been missing in this town for too long." The crowd stirred, whispers darting from one person to another. Some nodded, others lowered their heads. Crow shifted in his saddle, his smirk faltering at the strength of Jack's words. He raised his badge high. "Don't be fooled. I am the law here, and if I say Burke's claim stands, then it stands." Jack's rifle did not waver. His gaze swept over the people who had come, over faces worn from silence and bruised by years of submission. "You all know the truth," he said, his voice resonating like a prayer. "You've seen the bruises. You've heard the cries. You know the kind of men they are. Ask yourselves, is a badge enough to make cruelty right? Or is justice something greater, something worth standing for, even when it costs you everything?" The silence that followed was deep, heavy, alive. And then May stepped forward, her voice shaking but unbroken. "We are not the only ones they hurt," she declared, clutching Lily's hand. "We are only the ones left standing, but we stand for all of you too." Her words carried like wildfire, igniting courage where fear had lived for too long. Murmurs turned to voices, voices to shouts, until the tide shifted in full. Men who had bowed their heads lifted them. Women who had endured in silence raised their hands. Burke's power cracked before their eyes, his arrogance shrinking beneath the weight of truth spoken aloud. Burke's face darkened, rage twisting his features. "You think you can take what's mine?" he barked, drawing his pistol. But before he could aim, the sound of steel cocking filled the air. Jack's rifle, steady and unshaken. The townsfolk, emboldened, stepped closer, ropes and hands ready to bind the very men who had ruled them with fear. Sykes faltered, his knife slipping from his grip. Crow's smirk vanished as the crowd he had once bullied pressed in, demanding real justice. One by one, the pillars of their cruelty collapsed, until they were nothing but men stripped of power. Burke and Sykes were bound, marched off to face judgment they had thought themselves above. Crow's badge was torn from him, his authority crumbling in the dust. As the storm of violence ebbed, silence returned, but it was no longer heavy with fear. It was the silence of change, of wounds beginning to heal. Jack lowered his rifle, his chest heavy with the years that weighed on him, but his eyes lighter than they had been in a decade. May stood at his side, her hand brushing gently against his. The touch was small, tentative, but it carried the weight of a promise, of gratitude, of trust, of something more fragile and more powerful than either had dared to name. In her gaze he saw not only relief, but hope. A hope he thought he had buried with his past. The crowd began to disperse, voices mingling with the soft rustle of wind through the grass. The land, though scarred, seemed to breathe again. May turned her face toward Jack, her words quiet but certain. "You gave us back more than freedom. You gave us tomorrow." Jack's lips pressed into a line, his throat tight with emotions he had long forgotten how to voice. He only nodded, his silence carrying the depth of a vow. For in that moment, with the sisters at his side and the town reborn from its fear, he knew his redemption had begun. The sun lowered toward the horizon, painting the sky in hues of fire and rose. The ranch, once weary and broken, now glowed with a warmth that whispered of healing. For May and Lily, who had been dragged through despair, this place had become a haven. For Jack, who had lived too long in shadow, it had become a chance at light. And though danger had passed, the story was far from over. Beyond the horizon lay new trials, new choices, new chances to love and to heal. But in that fleeting moment, as the last light of day wrapped them in gold, three hearts found something they had thought lost forever: peace. The days after the confrontation unfolded with a quietness that felt almost unnatural, as though the earth itself was trying to soothe wounds that had bled for far too long. At Jack's ranch, the air was gentler. The sound of the wind moving through the fields, the soft clatter of hooves from his old horse, the creak of wood when the porch shifted beneath bare feet, each small thing felt like a balm laid upon scars that had nearly broken them. May found herself waking each morning with her heart still trembling, but with something new as well: safety. She would step outside, wrapped in her shawl, the cool air brushing her cheeks, and see Jack already working. His figure, broad and steady against the pale glow of dawn, was like an anchor in a world that had always felt too fragile. Watching him move with calm purpose, the way he fed the horse, repaired the fence, or simply paused to breathe in the open sky, brought her a healing she had not expected. Lily clung to her sister often, yet she too began to soften under the rhythm of the ranch. Her laughter, hesitant at first, grew brighter as she found small joys, chasing a chicken across the yard, helping Jack fetch water, or sitting by the fire as May brushed the dust from her hair. The girl who had cried herself raw now hummed softly at night, her voice weaving gentle threads of comfort through the dark. Jack carried himself as though nothing had changed, yet May noticed the quiet shifts. His eyes lingered longer when he watched them at supper. His voice, though gravelly, took on a gentler edge when he spoke to Lily. He left bread and honey on the table without comment, a simple kindness, but one that warmed May more deeply than grand gestures ever could. One evening, after Lily had gone to bed, May lingered on the porch. The lantern glowed behind her, casting her in soft light as the stars spread across the sky. Jack sat nearby, a pipe resting forgotten in his hand. For a long while, neither spoke. The silence between them was not heavy, but tender, filled with the unspoken truths of two souls who had suffered much, yet dared, against reason, to hope again. At last, May's voice broke the quiet. "I never thought there could be peace after what we've endured." Jack's gaze lifted to the stars, his jaw tightening. Peace is a fragile thing, but sometimes it comes when you least expect it. She turned toward him, her eyes shining with both sorrow and gratitude. "You've given us more than shelter, Jack. You've given us a chance to breathe." His throat worked as though the words he wanted to speak were caught there. Finally he murmured, "It's you who remind me to breathe again." The confession lingered between them like a soft flame, small yet steady. May's heart stirred, her chest warming in ways she had thought lost forever. For the first time she saw not only the weary rancher, but the man within him. Broken, yes, but not defeated. The days slipped into a rhythm that was almost gentle. May began to help with the chores, her hands learning the rough tasks of the ranch. She fetched water, gathered eggs, and tended the small garden by the side of the house. Jack showed her with patient movements, never rushing, never scolding. Sometimes their hands brushed, and each time the brief spark sent a quiet shiver through her. In the evenings they would sit together by the fire. Lily, curled in a blanket, would fall asleep to the low murmur of Jack's stories, fragments of his past, told not with pride, but with the humility of a man who had endured. May would listen, her heart aching for the child he had lost, the grief that had carved deep shadows into his soul. She longed to touch his hand, to let him know he was not alone, but for now her presence was her offering. One morning, as May carried a bucket from the well, she stumbled. The weight dragged her down, and water sloshed across the ground. Jack was there before the bucket hit the earth, his hand steadying her arm. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat the world stilled. His grip was strong, warm, protective. She caught her breath, feeling the steady pulse of his strength flowing into her. He let go slowly, as though reluctant to release her. "You don't have to do this," he said softly. May shook her head, her voice quiet but resolute. "I need to. I need to learn how to stand on my own, but it feels easier with you near." The words hung like a secret too tender to touch, yet Jack's eyes softened. He nodded once, not trusting himself to speak. The ranch became a place of slow healing, each day layering new strength over old wounds. Lily's laughter returned like music. May's spirit began to unfold, her smile no longer a memory, but a present reality. And Jack, though he carried his grief like a scar, felt something stirring within him that he had thought buried forever, a desire to live, not just survive. But shadows lingered still. The memory of Burke's threat hung over them, and Jack knew that safety was never permanent in a land ruled by greed and pride. Yet he also knew this: should the storm return, he would not face it alone. One evening, As twilight painted the sky in soft hues of lavender and gold, May stood beside Jack at the fence line. The air smelled of earth and pine, and the horizons stretched endless before them. She turned to him, her eyes luminous in the fading light. "Do you ever believe," she asked softly, "that broken things can be made whole again?" Jack's gaze lingered on her, his silence heavy with unspoken truths. Slowly, he answered, "If they find the right hands to hold them, maybe they can." Her heart ached at the tenderness in his voice. She wanted to reach for him, to close the space between them, but she held herself still, knowing that healing was not a rush, but a quiet unfolding. Still, the promise in his words wrapped around her like a blanket, warm and sure. The stars emerged one by one, scattering silver across the dark sky. Lily's laughter floated from inside the house, mingling with the gentle rustle of leaves. Jack and May stood together, side by side, watching the horizon where the land met the heavens. And though they did not speak of love, though the word remained unspoken, it lived there between them, in every glance, in every quiet act, in every shared silence that felt like home. The night deepened, and with it, the bond that tethered them grew stronger. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, its own uncertainties, but tonight was theirs, warm and fragile, a promise of what could be. And as the lantern glowed softly in the window behind them, May's hand brushed against Jack's. This time neither pulled away. The following week carried with it a quiet rhythm, as though the land itself wished to cradle its people into rest. The ranch settled into days that were slower, softer, yet beneath the gentle veneer, shadows still stirred. May awoke each morning with Lily curled beside her, the sound of roosters crowing beyond the window, and though her heart still trembled at times, she had begun to breathe more freely. The terror of Burke's hands seemed farther away with each sunrise, though the echo of his threat still lingered, a bruise that refused to fade entirely. Jack rose earlier than the dawn, his boots already carrying him across the yard before the first light touched the horizon. He moved like a man carved from the land, silent, steady, shoulders bearing the weight of years and storms. May often watched from the porch as he worked, her shawl pulled tight against the morning chill. There was something healing in his presence, something she could not name but felt deeply, like a slow fire warming the hollows of her chest. She began to help him more each day. At first with small things, gathering eggs, carrying water, stitching a tear in his worn shirt, then larger tasks, mending fences, holding a lantern while he fixed the barn roof, learning how to grind grain with steady hands. Their lives wove together in threads so subtle she hardly noticed when the line between survival and companionship blurred. Each act, no matter how simple, became a quiet exchange of trust. One evening, as the sky burned with hues of crimson and gold, May and Jack carried hay into the barn together. The air smelled of earth and horses, warm and grounding. Jack lifted bales with the strength of habit, his muscles taut beneath his shirt, his movements precise. May tried to match him, her arms straining, and when she faltered, he stepped close, steadying her without a word. Their shoulders brushed, a fleeting contact, but it sent a ripple through her chest that lingered long after the task was done. When they stepped outside, the sun had dipped low, painting the ranch in soft twilight. Lily's laughter rang from the porch, where she had been chasing fireflies, her small hands cupped around the glowing creatures. Jack watched her with a faint smile, the kind that softened the lines of grief etched deep in his face. May noticed it, her heart catching at the tenderness he tried so often to hide. "She makes me think of what was lost," he said quietly, his voice rough but steady, "but also of what can still be found." May's breath caught. She turned toward him, her eyes searching his profile, etched in gold and shadow. "You carry so much pain, Jack. Yet you still choose to protect, to care. That kind of strength, it heals more than you know." His gaze flickered to hers, and for a moment the air between them pulsed with something unspoken, fragile and profound. He did not reply, but the silence carried the weight of words neither dared to release. The nights grew cooler, and with them came moments of closeness that neither had planned yet both craved. Around the fire, Jack would tell stories of the land, his voice low and steady, and May would listen with her hand resting lightly on her sister's. Sometimes Lily would drift to sleep, leaving only the two of them awake, their conversation slipping into quiet truths. He confessed the guilt that had hollowed him, the memory of a daughter's cry he could never silence. She confessed the fear that had chained her, the shame of choices forced upon her to save the one she loved most. Each confession was a wound laid bare, and each was met with gentleness, not judgment. In that sharing, a kind of healing grew, a recognition that brokenness could be seen and still cherished. One night, when the wind rattled the shutters and the moon hung pale above, May stepped outside alone. The night was cool, the earth smelling of sage and pine. She lifted her face to the stars, her shawl slipping from her shoulders, her heart too full to contain. Jack joined her quietly, his steps soft against the porch boards. For a while they simply stood together, gazing at the endless sky. "Do you ever think," she asked softly, "that love can be born from pain?" Jack's jaw tightened, his silence stretching long. Then he answered, his voice almost a whisper. "Sometimes pain is the only soil deep enough to grow it." Her heart stirred, her breath shivering with the tenderness of the moment. She did not take his hand, though she wanted to. Instead, she let her shoulder rest lightly against his arm. He did not move away. Together they stood, silent but bound, while the stars bore witness to a love too young to name, yet already strong enough to heal. Days turned again, and the world reminded them that peace is never permanent. Riders passed near the ranch one morning, their faces unfamiliar, but their eyes sharp with recognition. May saw them from the window, unease prickling her skin. Jack met her gaze when he returned from the yard, his expression grave. "They'll test us again," he said simply. Fear rose in her chest, but this time it did not consume her. She looked at him, at the quiet strength in his stance, and she found her courage mirrored there. "Then we will face it," she replied. Her words carried a conviction that surprised even her, but Jack nodded, a faint flicker of pride in his eyes. In that moment she realized she was no longer merely surviving. She was choosing to stand, to believe, to love. The tension in the air did not erase the warmth of their bond. If anything, it deepened it. The threat of storms on the horizon only made the small moments more precious, the laughter at supper, the comfort of shared work, the healing found in simple touches. May began to believe that love was not a sudden flame, but a slow fire, steady and enduring, lit by choice as much as by passion. One evening, as Lily slept and the fire crackled low, May finally reached across the space between them. Her hand touched Jack's, her fingers brushing against his calloused skin. He looked at her, his eyes shadowed by years yet lit with something new. She did not speak, nor did he. But when his fingers curled gently around hers, the silence between them was enough. And so, with the night wrapped around them and the stars watching overhead, their story moved forward. Two broken souls finding strength in each other, a bond fragile yet unbreakable, preparing them for whatever trials the world would place before their door. The horizon darkened with more than clouds. By late afternoon, the air felt charged, heavy with the promise of something neither peaceful nor kind. Jack sensed it before the dust even rose on the far edge of the plain. His shoulders stiffened as he leaned on the fence rail, eyes narrowing against the glare of the sinking sun. A rider had appeared in the distance, then two, then more, their silhouettes jagged against the fading light. Inside the house, May felt the unease ripple through her chest before she even saw them. She gathered Lily close, pressing a soft kiss to her sister's forehead, whispering healing words that had become her shield. "We are safe here. Remember, we are not alone." Her voice carried the fragile strength of someone who had lived through storms and learned to stand. When Jack stepped onto the porch, his rifle already slung across his shoulder, May followed him. Her shawl wrapped tight, her eyes steady, though her heart raced. She stood beside him without words, because her presence itself was an answer. She would not run, not any more. The riders drew nearer, their faces grim. Among them was Burke, no longer sneering but hardened, his humiliation sharpened into hunger for vengeance. Sykes rode close, his hand on his knife, while others, rough men with restless eyes, circled like wolves. At their center was Deputy Crow, his badge replaced but his arrogance intact, as though shame could not cling to him. They halted at the edge of the yard, dust swirling around their horses. Burke's voice rang out, coarse and bitter. "You think you've beaten me, Colton? You think one night changes who owns this town?" Jack's gaze was calm, his voice steady. "It's not about ownership. It's about what's right. And you know, Burke, you lost that a long time ago." The crowd from town had begun to gather again, drawn by the thunder of hooves. Faces appeared along the road, hesitant but curious, carrying the memory of the last stand. May saw them and knew this was more than a fight for her and Lily. It was the town itself being called to choose again. Burke spat into the dust. "You think they'll stand with you forever? Fear is stronger than courage, old man." "Always has been." Jack lifted his rifle, not in threat but in declaration. "Not today." The silence that followed was sharp, every breath suspended. Then, from behind him, May's voice rose clear. "Burke, you tried to break us, but you failed. You've hurt too many, taken too much, and tonight you will answer for it." The townsfolk stirred, their eyes widening at her words. Lily clutched May's hand, trembling, but she did not pull her sister back. She stood with her, a fragile but unyielding pillar of courage. Burke's laughter was hollow, cracked by his own uncertainty. "A woman's words don't change the world." But they already had. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, voices joining in quiet agreement. Jack felt the tide turning, the air thick with the weight of choice. The confrontation snapped when Sykes lunged forward, his knife flashing, but Jack's rifle lifted with swift precision, its barrel gleaming in the low sun. "Not another step," he warned, his tone low, carved with unshakable resolve. Sykes froze, his bravado withering in the face of certainty. Crow tried to rally, shouting about the law, but his words fell flat. The people had seen the truth too many times. Badges meant nothing when they were worn by men who fed on fear. Neighbors stepped forward, men and women who had been silent too long. Some carried ropes, some tools, some only their voices, but together they formed a wall stronger than any weapon. Burke's men shifted uneasily in their saddles, the balance of power slipping away like water through open hands. Jack felt May's presence beside him like a steady flame. Her strength fed his, her courage echoing through the crowd. And when Lily lifted her chin, whispering, "We are not afraid anymore," the words spread like fire. Burke's face twisted, his arrogance collapsing into desperation. He reached for his pistol, but before it cleared the holster, half a dozen townsfolk surged forward, ropes tightening around his arms, dragging him from his horse. Sykes was disarmed in the same breath, his knife clattering to the ground. Crow's protest was drowned by the roar of voices demanding justice. The dust settled slowly, but when it did, the storm was over. Burke and his men lay bound, stripped of power. Crow's false authority had crumbled into nothing but dust at his feet, and in their place rose the people, no longer trembling, no longer silent. Jack lowered his rifle, his chest heavy, but his eyes met May's, and in that gaze was something neither cruelty nor time could take away. She stepped closer, her hand finding his, her touch warm against his calloused skin. "It's over," she whispered, though they both knew healing was a journey, not a moment. Still, hope shimmered in her voice like dawn after a long night. The crowd began to disperse, carrying the echoes of courage with them. Some lingered to thank Jack, others to squeeze May's hand or offer Lily a reassuring smile. For the first time, the town stood lighter, freer, their steps no longer shackled by fear. As the sun dipped fully below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of indigo and rose, Jack, May, and Lily stood together on the porch. The land stretched endless before them, scarred yet alive, whispering promises of tomorrow. Lily leaned against her sister, her eyes heavy with sleep, but her smile soft. May brushed a strand of hair from the girl's face, her touch tender, healing. Then her gaze lifted to Jack, who stood at her side, his shoulders no longer burdened quite the same. "You gave us back more than freedom," she said, her voice hushed but sure. "You gave us the chance to love again." Jack's lips curved, faint but real, his silence carrying the depth of everything he could not yet say. He looked out over the land, then back at her, and in his eyes shone the promise of something neither had expected, a future. The stars rose one by one, silver lanterns against the dark, and in their light 3 broken souls, once scattered by sorrow, stood together as though they had always belonged. The night was theirs, quiet and warm, filled with the healing hum of crickets and the steady rhythm of hope. Beyond the horizon, life waited with new trials, but for now, in the tender hush of evening, Jack and May stood side by side, their hands entwined, ready for whatever the dawn would bring. The days after the confrontation carried a stillness that seemed almost foreign, as if the land itself exhaled after holding its breath for too long. At Jack's ranch, the quiet did not feel like fear anymore, but like healing, fragile, uncertain, yet real. May woke each morning to the pale light spilling through the window, Lily curled against her shoulder, the soft hum of roosters greeting the dawn. She would rise, her steps lighter than before, her heart no longer bound by the same weight of dread. Jack was always outside before the sun fully crested the horizon, his figure outlined against the golden edge of the world. She watched him sometimes from the doorway, broad shoulders carrying buckets of water, hands working leather straps, movements strong and deliberate. There was no arrogance in him, only steady endurance, like the earth itself moving forward, no matter how many storms had carved it. That steadiness soothed her, wrapping around the ache she had carried for so long. The ranch became their refuge. Lily's laughter returned first, shy but bright, as she chased chickens across the yard or ran barefoot through the grass. At night she fell asleep by the fire with crumbs of cornbread still on her lips, and May would brush hair from her face, whispering words of comfort that no longer trembled with fear. Healing came slowly, but it came, woven into small routines, tender gestures, and the shelter of Jack's quiet strength. May began to share in the work of the ranch, her hands learning the rhythm of chores she had never known before. She drew water from the well, mended torn cloth, learned how to grind grain with steady turns of the millstone. Jack guided her with patience, never scolding, never rushing. Sometimes their hands brushed when he passed her tools, and though neither spoke of it, the touch lingered in her chest long after. One evening, the air thick with the scent of sage and pine, May and Jack walked the fence line together. The sun melted into the horizon, leaving streaks of violet and rose across the sky. They spoke little, yet their silences had grown warm, no longer heavy but filled with understanding. At the far edge of the pasture, May paused, resting her hand on the wooden post. "Do you ever believe," she asked softly, her eyes on the horizon, "that broken things can be made whole again?" Jack's gaze lingered on her, his silence deep. At last he answered, his voice low, edged with both sorrow and hope. "If they find the right hands to hold them, maybe they can." Her heart stirred at his words. She turned toward him, and for a moment the space between them felt charged, as though the whole earth held its breath. His eyes were shadowed with grief, but also with something gentler, a light he had not let anyone see in years. She wanted to reach for him, to close the distance, but she only smiled faintly, letting the promise rest between them like an unopened letter. Days slipped into a rhythm both simple and profound. Jack taught Lily how to ride his old horse, her laughter ringing out over the fields as he steadied her in the saddle. May watched from the porch, her chest warm with gratitude. In the evenings, they gathered by the fire, Jack telling quiet stories of the land and its storms. May listened, her hand resting lightly on Lily's, her gaze often drifting to Jack's profile, the hard lines softened by the glow of flame. One night, after Lily had fallen asleep, May lingered by the hearth. Jack sat across from her, his eyes fixed on the flames, his jaw set, as though wrestling with words he had buried too long. At last he spoke. "I failed once," he said, his voice rough, carrying the weight of a wound carved deep. "My daughter. I couldn't save her. That scream, what you heard in the saloon, it tore me back to that night. I swore never to draw my gun again. But when I heard Lily—" His throat tightened, his eyes glistening with a pain he rarely allowed to show. "I couldn't let history repeat itself." May's chest ached. She rose, moving quietly until she was beside him. She did not speak empty comforts. Instead, she rested her hand gently over his. His skin was calloused, scarred, but warm, alive. "You didn't fail us," she whispered. "You saved us, and in doing so, you saved yourself too, though you may not see it yet." He turned his gaze to her, and in that moment, the silence was heavier than words, filled with the fragile, undeniable truth of what was growing between them. He did not pull his hand away. The following days brought small storms of their own. Strangers rode near the ranch, faces half hidden beneath hats, watching from a distance before disappearing into the hills. Burke's threat had been silenced, but not erased. The land carried rumors like the wind, whispers of men gathering, of debts unsettled. Jack remained vigilant, his rifle never far from reach, but May noticed something new in his stance. He was no longer a man standing alone. He was a protector who had found something worth protecting. And she, once broken by fear, now carried a quiet strength of her own. She no longer saw herself as a victim of Burke's cruelty. She was a sister, a woman, a soul capable of standing. She rose each day not only for Lily's sake, but for her own, and for the man who had risked everything to give them another chance at life. One twilight, as the stars began to scatter across the darkening sky, May and Jack found themselves side by side on the porch. Lily's laughter floated from inside, mingling with the crackle of the fire. The air was cool, the world softened by dusk. Without thinking, May let her hand brush against Jack's. This time, he did not hesitate. His fingers curled around hers, rough but tender, steady as the land beneath their feet. They did not speak of love, not yet. But in the silence of that moment, in the warmth of joined hands beneath the starlit sky, it was there. Quiet, healing, undeniable. The night stretched long and gentle, a promise of something beyond survival. Together, they looked out at the land that had seen too much sorrow and now offered them the fragile gift of tomorrow. And though storms might yet rise on the horizon, they knew they would face them side by side, bound not only by survival, but by something deeper, something that could grow into a love strong enough to heal even the deepest wounds. Morning light fell across the ranch like a soft blanket, painting the wooden boards in hues of amber. The world outside had not forgotten its dangers, but within the walls of the homestead there was a sense of fragile peace, a tender space where wounds slowly mended. May awoke to the sound of sparrows fluttering by the window. Beside her, Lily still slept, her breath even, her face free of the shadows that once haunted it. May brushed a hand gently across her sister's hair, her chest warming at the simple miracle of seeing her safe. She stepped outside, the chill of dawn touching her skin. Jack was already there, as always, standing by the fence line, his eyes on the horizon. There was a heaviness in his stance, but it was different now. Less the weight of despair, more the quiet burden of a man who had found something precious to protect. When he turned, their gazes met. No words were spoken, yet May felt her breath catch, for in that look lay a promise, unspoken but steady. "I will not let harm reach you again." The days unfolded with the rhythm of a life rebuilt. May took on more of the work, her hands roughened by chores, but her spirit strengthened. Jack taught her how to milk the cow, showing her the rhythm with patient movements, his large hand guiding hers until she found the flow. Their laughter rose when she spilled the pail, the sound light and free, breaking the walls of silence that had long caged them both. Lily, curious and eager, joined in, and soon the barn rang with the kind of warmth May had thought lost to her forever. Evenings were their sanctuary. The fire crackled low, shadows dancing across the walls, as Jack spoke in his gravelly voice of lands far beyond the plains, of rivers that cut through stone, of nights under open skies. Lily would curl beside May, drifting into sleep, leaving her sister and Jack in the soft intimacy of quiet conversation. May found herself sharing more than she had ever spoken aloud, memories of her parents, of hardships endured, of dreams she had once buried deep. Jack listened, his eyes steady, and in his listening she felt seen, not as a broken woman, but as someone still whole. One night, when the wind whistled against the shutters, May lingered by the doorway, watching Jack mend a harness by the lamplight. His hands, strong yet careful, worked with a precision that fascinated her. She stepped closer, her heart tugging with a tenderness she could no longer ignore. "You carry so much alone," she whispered. Jack looked up, his eyes catching hers. The silence that stretched between them was heavy with meaning. "I carried it alone because there was no one left to share it with," he said finally. His voice was low, rough with honesty. "But maybe I don't have to anymore." May's breath caught. She reached out, her fingers brushing his, the contact small, yet filled with unspoken longing. For the first time in years, Jack let himself lean into another's presence, his hand turning slightly to hold hers. It was not a declaration, not yet, but it was a beginning, the fragile birth of something healing, tender and real. As spring edged nearer, the land bloomed. Wildflowers dotted the fields, their colors bright against the green. Lily ran through them, her laughter ringing like bells, her arms filled with blossoms she carried back to the porch. May wove the flowers into crowns, placing one on her sister's head, then daring to place another gently on Jack's weathered brow. He grumbled at the silliness, but the smile that tugged at his lips betrayed him. It was the first time May had seen joy flicker across his face without restraint, and it filled her chest with warmth so deep she thought she might weep. But joy was always tempered by the knowledge of lurking shadows. Travellers brought word of unrest, men whispering of debts unpaid, of allies of Burke who still plotted revenge. Jack listened quietly to such talk in town, his jaw tightening, though he carried little of it back to the ranch. Yet May could see the tension in him, the way his eyes swept the horizon each evening, the rifle kept close by his side. One evening, after a long day of work, May found him standing outside, staring at the darkening plains. She stepped beside him, her shawl wrapped tight, and asked softly, "Do you think it will come back? The danger?" He nodded slowly. "Danger never truly leaves, but neither does courage." Her heart steadied at his words. She slipped her hand into his, finding comfort in the warmth of his palm. "Then we face it together," she said, her voice carrying a strength she did not know she possessed. He looked at her then, his eyes heavy with the weight of all he had lost, yet alight with the fragile hope of what he had found. "Together," he echoed, and the word felt like a vow. Their bond deepened in the quiet acts of each day. Jack taught Lily how to shoot with a small rifle, guiding her hands with patience, teaching her not to fear but to respect the weapon. May watched, pride mingling with unease, but when Lily struck the target, her laughter was so pure that May's heart swelled. It was not just survival Jack was teaching them, it was strength, a way to stand unbroken in a world that too often tried to shatter them. Nights grew warmer, and often they sat outside beneath the stars. May would lean against Jack's shoulder, the vast sky stretching above them, the crickets singing softly in the grass. His arm would brush hers, steady and strong, and she would feel herself anchored in ways she had never known. The ranch no longer felt like just shelter. It felt like home. Yet Jack wrestled with his heart. Alone in the barn, he would pause in his work, his thoughts heavy. He feared what it meant to love again, to open wounds that had long been closed. He feared losing them, feared that fate would steal from him once more. But each time he saw May's smile, or Lily's laughter, or felt the warmth of their presence, those fears loosened, replaced by a quiet yearning for a life he had thought beyond him. One night, when the moon was high and silver light spilled across the yard, May found him sitting alone on the porch. She sat beside him without hesitation, their shoulders touching. For a while they watched the night in silence. Then, softly, she said, "I never thought I could feel safe again. But here, with you, I do." Jack turned, his eyes searching hers, the shadows of grief still there, but tempered now by something gentler. He lifted a hand, hesitating, then brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. His touch was tentative, almost reverent. May closed her eyes, leaning into it, her heart opening in quiet surrender. Their lips met not with urgency, but with the tenderness of two souls who had waited too long to believe in love again. It was warm, healing, filled with the promise of something new. When they parted, the silence between them was no longer empty. It was full of hope, of trust, of love blooming fragile but fierce. Inside, Lily stirred in her sleep, unaware of the new chapter unfolding just beyond the door. The ranch was still a place of shadows and threats, but in that moment, beneath the silver gaze of the moon, 3 lives had intertwined into something stronger than fear. Tomorrow would bring trials, as it always did, but tonight belonged to them, Jack, May, and Lily. Bound by courage, warmed by love, healed by the simple truth that even in the harshest lands, hearts could find one another and broken souls could be made whole again. The summer sun rose high over the plains, painting the sky in bold strokes of gold and blue. Life at the ranch had settled into a rhythm both simple and profound. Days filled with work, evenings with laughter, nights with quiet conversation beneath the stars. Jack found himself growing accustomed to the sound of May's voice humming softly as she cooked, to Lily's laughter ringing out across the yard, to the warmth that now filled spaces once empty. The ranch, once hollow with silence, now carried the pulse of life. But peace in the West was never absolute. Rumours drifted on the wind, whispers of men who still carried Burke's bitterness in their blood. They were not as bold as their leader had been, but vengeance has a way of festering in shadows. Jack felt it like a storm building on the horizon, distant but certain. His hand lingered longer on his rifle each morning, his eyes scanning the far ridges as he worked the fields. May noticed the tension in him, the way his jaw tightened when riders passed too near, the silence that fell heavy when news from town hinted at unrest. She knew he was carrying more than his share of fear, and so she began to share it with him, not in words of worry, but in simple acts of care. When he returned from town, she met him with bread still warm from the oven. When he stood late into the night on the porch, she joined him, her shawl brushing against his arm, her presence a reminder that he was not alone anymore. One evening, the sky burned crimson as the sun slipped low. Jack leaned against the porch rail, his gaze fixed on the distant horizon. May stepped out, her hand brushing his arm, her voice soft. "The world may carry storms, Jack, but you don't have to face them alone." He turned to her, his eyes shadowed yet softened. "I spent years believing solitude was safer, but you've shown me solitude is only another kind of death." His voice cracked, low and raw. "You've given me something I thought was gone forever, reason to keep breathing." Her chest ached at his words. She reached for his hand, holding it tight. "And you've given us something too, a home, a chance to live without fear." The bond between them had grown strong, unshakable, yet the test of it came sooner than either expected. At dawn one morning, the sound of hooves thundered against the ground. Jack stepped onto the porch, rifle in hand, his stance steady as stone. 4 riders approached, their faces hardened, their eyes sharp with old hatred. They were men who had once followed Burke, men who had not forgiven the loss of their power. The air tightened with tension as they halted before the ranch. One of them, broad-shouldered and scarred, spat into the dust. "Colton," he growled, "you think you ended it. Burke may be gone, but debts don't vanish so easy." Jack's rifle stayed steady. His voice, calm and unyielding, carried across the yard. "You'll find no debt here, only freedom. Turn back and let this land rest." The men sneered, their hands twitching near their weapons. May stood in the doorway, Lily clutching her skirt. Fear coiled in her chest, but she refused to let it take her voice. Stepping forward, she called out, her words trembling but resolute. "This place is not yours to claim." "Ah, it belongs to no cruelty, no fear. Leave us be." Her courage struck like a spark. The townsfolk, drawn by the noise, began to gather along the road, just as they had before. Men and women, weary but brave, voices rising in support. The riders glanced around, their arrogance wavering beneath the weight of so many eyes. One spat curses, but their power crumbled in the light of defiance. Slowly, bitterly, they turned their horses, retreating into the dust from which they came. The storm had broken before it began, undone not by bullets, but by voices unwilling to bow again. When the dust settled, Jack lowered his rifle. His shoulders eased, and for the first time in years, he felt the weight truly lift. May moved to his side, her hand slipping into his, her eyes shining with both relief and pride. Lily ran to them, her small arms wrapping tight around them both. Together they stood, bound by something far greater than fear, by love, by trust, by the healing promise of a life reborn. In the days that followed, the ranch blossomed into more than a refuge. It became a place of laughter, of shared labor, of dreams whispered by firelight. May tended the garden with Lily, planting seeds not just in soil, but in hope. Jack repaired the old barn, his hands steady with purpose, each board nailed into place like a vow to the future. At night, they sat beneath the stars, Jack's arm around May's shoulders, her head resting against him, their silence filled with peace. One evening, Lily crowned them both with flowers she had woven, her laughter spilling bright as she declared them king and queen of the ranch. Jack grumbled, embarrassed, but May's smile softened him until even he could not resist the joy of the moment. In that laughter, in that warmth, the ghosts of sorrow loosened their hold. Love came not in grand declarations, but in the quiet unfolding of days shared, hands brushing while mending fences, smiles exchanged across supper, the comfort of simply existing together. And when Jack finally whispered the words late one night, his voice thick with emotion, May's heart answered before her lips did. Their kiss was slow, healing, a promise sealed beneath the endless sky. The ranch, once a place of solitude, had become a sanctuary not only for survival, but for love. The town, once shackled by fear, had begun to find its voice again, and Jack, May, and Lily, three broken souls, had found one another, piecing together a family born not of blood, but of choice, of courage, of the belief that even in the harshest of worlds, healing could grow. So, dear friend, if this story touched your heart, if you felt the tremor of courage in May's voice, the strength in Jack's stand, or the innocence in Lily's laughter, let your voice echo too. Leave a comment, share your thoughts, press the like button so these stories may keep breathing. And if you wish to walk beside us into the next tale, subscribe so no chapter is lost to the silence of the wind. For in the end, stories only live when they are shared, and love, like healing, grows stronger when passed from one heart to another.